Hey, this is Jürgen Rasmussen. Welcome to the Provocative Hypnosis blog. This particular episode is about how to recognize a true professional and my take on what it takes to really be a mature, true professional or master of your own craft. Here's a very interesting experiment to do. If you want to discover if a psychiatrist has any real perspective on their own profession, have a conversation with that psychiatrist and ask, what do you think about Dr. Evan Cameron, the work of Dr. Evan Cameron? In all likelihood, the psychiatrist is just going to give you a blank stare. I'm going to argue that if he or she does that, that should kind of scare the crap out of you as a consumer of services, right? You may Google, after you watch this particular episode, Dr. Evan Cameron on Google, obviously, and you'll recognize that this was a guy who was a president of the World Psychiatric Association. He was a president of the American and Canadian Psychiatric Association. He was revered among his peers as a very proficient man. But this guy was a pure criminal. And he was in the 50s and 60s paid by the CIA covertly to be part of the MK Ultra project. And what he would do at the hospital he worked on in Montreal was that he would take people, very often people with regular anxieties and were depressed and stuff like that, and he would give them 30 to 40 times the amount of electroconvulsive treatment. He'd put them in drug-induced comas and play repetitive tape loops. Now, the whole intent here by putting people in drug-induced comas, severe electroconvulsive therapy, and playing these tape loops was to experiment to see if you could build a Manchurian candidate of sorts. This whole project was paid by the CIA. This is not a conspiracy theory, by the way. You can read up on this. You can buy the psychiatrist Thomas Saw's book, Coercion as Cure, if you want the full story on this. But this guy was as unethical, as psychopathic, as unscrupulous, as abusive, a torturer, with a complete disregard for the humanity of the people who sought his help. You know, there are many scandals, of course, in psychiatry, and you couldn't possibly expect, you know, any psychiatrist or medical doctor or psychologist to know about all these scandals. But a guy who used to be president of the World Psychiatric Association and the American and the Canadian Psychiatric Association, if you ask a psychiatrist this question, and he hasn't even heard about Dr. Evan Cameron, that should be a red flag. That should be a red flag. That should be a red flag that alerts you that this person does not really have a perspective on their own profession. They haven't done their own independent study. They haven't looked at the critics or the scandals. And as a result, I would say that that's an immature practitioner, right? So, to be able to be a mature master of your craft, of course you need technical skill and you need experience and you should have a good sense of ethics. But that's not really enough. You really need to have perspective on your own profession. You need to have perspective on the various frameworks, the various deep assumptions that the teachings of your professions are based upon. I made a video about the importance of freedom of speech a while back, and a very common argument that those of us who are champions for freedom of speech will often use is you need to be able to have freedom of speech to be able to think, to be able to explore your own thinking, and to be able to understand your own position, because the only way you can really have any perspective on or understand your own position about anything is if you can relate your positions to complementary perspectives. Meaning, if you get pushback, if you get criticism, if you actively seek out competing, contradictory, and other complementary perspectives, only by doing that can you hope to gain not a full, because you'll never have a full understanding of anything, but only by doing that can you hope to get a somewhat mature stance on your own position, right? So what I'm trying to say to you is you should have at least basic knowledge of the various therapeutic modalities and frameworks when it comes to the whole field of psychology to really be a professional agent of change. So let me give you a couple of examples of this, and let me give you a little bit of my own journey in this. So quite a few years ago, I had a client who had a huge insight due to me recommending a book. And that book was called Speed Reading People, and it's about the Myers-Briggs typology, a way of personality assessment, so to speak, which is kind of based upon the work of Carl Jung to a large degree, has been very popular in the corporate world. Now, that book, Speed Reading People, I think I've only ever recommended to one particular client, and that was this particular client. She read that book and she had a huge aha experience that was extremely useful to her, because it evoked in her a understanding that there are other ways of seeing the world. And that book was a great vehicle to have that happen. Now, do I think that the Myers-Briggs typology is accurate or stands up to scrutiny, or am I aware that there's very weak, call it science behind it? Yes, sure. Am I a believer in it? Not really. But I know about it, right? So the reason why I recommended that particular book to that particular client is because I had a hunch that it would be a useful tool to help her complement her own perspective in relationship to conflicts that she had in her life. It would help her loosen a fixed perspective. So even if the model may not be up to par, so to speak, it was still useful knowing about it to help a client develop a richer map. Remember this, clients very often have fixed ideas around the topics and the context in which they are stuck. Very often, we can help people tremendously just by introducing choice, or more of a both and, where there was a strong emotional either or. But to be able to do that in an artistic way, to be able to do that in a way that matches up with your particular clients, you need to have a lot of perspectives. You need to have a lot of frameworks. You need a deep map, so to speak, to operate from. So quite recently, I worked with another client who seemed to run into trouble with people displayed particular patterns of thinking, feeling, behaving. And she would attribute to the people who seem to operate that way, as assholes, as selfish bastards, as stupid, and as evil. These may be valid perspectives, by the way. But that was her only map. And given that I've explored adult developmental psychology quite a bit, I was able to see that what she's really struggling with, or really, but this is a way of thinking about it, what she's struggling with are people who seem to operate from a particular developmental stage. So from a ego development, Jane Lovinger, Susanne Cook-Reuter perspective, you could call this the opportunist stage. If you study the work of Claire Graves, it would be the CP stage, or spiral dynamics, red. Or if you were to study the work of Robert Keegan, it would be the second order of consciousness. So being able to spot that pattern and knowing that here's a useful complementary perspective, I introduced her to some of Susanne Cook-Reuter's work and videos. And she had a huge aha experience based upon that. Because she was able to develop more choice and to no longer take personally something that wasn't really personal, right? I'm not saying that Lovinger or Susanne Cook-Reuter's model is true with a capital T. I'm saying it's a particular way of looking at the selfing process, often a useful perspective. For another client, I may have had them look up, cluster B personality disorders, psychopathy, narcissism, these sorts of things. That's also a particular lens that you can look at human meaning making through. The more lenses you have, the more perspective you have, the richer your model of the world has a tendency to be. Now, there's a couple of things I want to address here. Is A, don't be limited by science or what's called evidence-based practice. Now, I'm a fan of science. I'm a fan of the scientific method. I'm also a big fan of the values that are supposed to drive the scientific enterprise, looking for truth and evidence and stuff like that. But in the case of, for example, Myers-Briggs, there's not much science to support it. But it was a useful model for that particular client, right? Now, let's say that a client comes in, especially these days where people have the internet, people read, people have more access to psychological tools. A lot of people have listened to people like Jordan Peterson, for example. Or let's say that you get a client who has a background in philosophy, or who is a psychologist, or who works in that profession. Let's say that your client has a deep interest in evolutionary psychology. You should be able to have a conversation with that person, at least. Meaning, you should know enough about evolutionary psychology and its premises so that you can have an intelligent discussion with a person who has an interest in evolutionary psychology. If you have a client who comes in who's been to psychoanalysis, for example, your response shouldn't just be psychoanalysis sucks. You should know enough about Freud and psychoanalysis and the premises behind it that you can have an intelligent discussion with that particular client about psychoanalysis. Or if someone comes in and they say, look, I was at this seminar at work, you know, and we did the 5-factor personality thing, or we did Myers-Briggs. Well, given that these are very well-known tools and frameworks, you should at least have a basic understanding of what these things are. Or let's say that your client comes in and they've seen the Lie to Me, you know, TV series, loosely based upon the work of Paul Ekman, and they start talking to you about, you know, lies and deceptions and not microaggressions, that's something else, micro expressions and subtle expressions, for example. If you haven't even heard about Paul Ekman, who's such a prominent figure in that field, that's a bit bizarre. You should have read up on that. You should know what micro expressions are. If someone says, well, you know, what about Lisa Feldman Barrett's critique of Paul Ekman, or what about truth default theory when it comes to deception, for example? Again, you know, you should have a basic look. You'll never be able to study everything and know everything, and this is a work in progress. But even if you're a hypnotherapist, or your base is NLP, or whatever it might be, the only way you'll end up having a really mature understanding of even your own profession is if you can relate it to other complementary frameworks. See, the only way you'll ever really be able to do it. Now, of course, you need client experience. You should do all the experiments. I mean, you should do the experiments. You got to see your clients. You got to get your experience. But you should also read the literature. So for example, in my own personal journey, I've discovered that, you know, there's this often given advice that if what you're doing isn't working, do something else, and that's often good advice, but you should have more than that. You shouldn't just be restricted to trying to do something else based upon the same deep assumptions or premises. You should be able to shift frameworks. You should be able to change the framework you operate from, or the very way you understand the interaction between you and that particular client. That gives you a hell of a lot more choice. So one thing I would do, you know, learning all these different modalities, is I would often take some time and only practice a particular modality. So here are some of my explorations, you know, throughout the years. So I started out with meditation at age 14, and I've been a regular meditator ever since. So I'm well familiar with various forms of meditation and non-duality and self-inquiry and all that sort of stuff, right? I'm also familiar with related fields, such as the 3 principles, for example, as formulated by Sydney Banks. I have a solid NLP background, studying both what's referred to as classic code and also new code NLP. I had John Grinder, who was co-founder of NLP, as kind of an unofficial mentor. He was very generous to me. I've made a video on this channel titled What John Grinder Taught Me, you know, for about 5 or 6 years. So I'm very familiar with that way of kind of, you know, working. And what became obvious to me was very often when, you know, hypnotherapists or other psychotherapists or psychologists would criticize NLP, was that they have no idea what it even is. Like, they lack a basic understanding of even what it is. Like there's this guy called Dr. Todd Grande, you know, on YouTube, who criticizes all these modalities, and he made a video critiquing NLP, but it's very clear that he has no even basic idea of what it is, you know? Like the litmus test is find an experienced NLPer and ask him, you know, these fundamental assumptions I have here about what you guys are doing, you know, is this accurate? Studied hypnosis, right? And I really got into the work of Milton Erickson. But again, you know, very often when people study hypnosis, they study one particular school or one particular approach. So if a fellow hypnotherapist comes into you and says, you know, what do you think about the Spiegel eye roll? You know, if you don't even know what the person's talking about, you don't have perspective on your own profession, you know. Or if someone says, what about the Carleton Skills training package in terms of taking low hypnotizables and turning them into high hypnotizables? Again, it's not about whether you agree with the theories of Nicholas Spanos, but you should at least know about it. You should have read up about it so that you're actually a professional. You know, you should have studied Milton Erickson's work. You know, the pioneers. You should know about the work of people like Hilgard and Watkins and, you know, Spiegel, and perhaps even people like Dave Ellman and you know, you should be able to make an argument for the state or trait theories of hypnosis versus the more socio-cognitive models of hypnosis. Again, what you believe and what you agree with, you know, is something else entirely, but you should at least understand it, right? So if you're a hypnotherapist and you listen to me speak right now and you suddenly go, I had no fucking clue what this guy's talking about, that's a hint. That's a red flag that you're not yet a mature professional when it comes to this sort of stuff. I've deeply looked into the work of you know, various Erickson-related schools of psychotherapy. You know, people like Jay Haley, family therapy, people like Frank Farrelly with provocative therapy. William Glasser's choice theory and reality theory has been extremely useful to me. This is a very different framework than what I've mentioned so far. So with some clients, you could see me adopt a more William Glasser reality therapy based framework, and I could look like a practitioner of that. It's a very different framework. I've deeply studied the work of Albert Ellis, rational emotive behavior therapy, and CBT. I could easily take that hat on. On a different day, I might do stuff that looks more like the work of Byron Katie. Of course, those of you who know my work know that I teach a particular psychological evolution model. But I also have many other frameworks that I can view things through. So, you know, some rare session I might do a psychosensory form of therapy, such as havening. I don't do that a lot, but I know how to do it. I've trained in it. I've looked into adult developmental psychology. So I trained with Chris Coven in spiral dynamics and had many interactions with him over the years. And he, of course, studied with the late Claire Graves. Chris Coven is also dead, so I should say the late Chris Coven. I've studied ego development theory. You know, I've studied Robert Keegan's orders of consciousness model, and so the whole developmental perspective is a perspective that you don't find in hypnotherapy, you don't find in NLP, but it can be a very useful complementary angle to work with, and can sometimes help you connect the dots with certain clients. In addition to this, I've looked quite a bit into evolutionary psychology, for example. I looked into criminology research quite a bit. I studied the work of Thomas Sauce quite a bit regarding psychiatry. I've studied a lot of integral philosophy, Ken Wilber's work, as well as other philosophers. I've looked into, cluster B personality tendencies, in more recent years, narcissism, psychopathic tendencies. That's a very different angle that I used to be very, very opposed to, but I found having some knowledge about it is quite useful. And breath work. I've especially recently, I've been very much into breath work. I've been sporadically over the years, but the work of Konstantin Bateko and stuff like that. So some sessions I might look more like a breath work guy, right? But I think the litmus test is the person who only knows one particular model, or who signs up for a course through a company or through a university and becomes a mouthpiece for that, is not really a mature professional. You should be aware of the criticisms against your own profession. You should be able to argue against your own positions and your own stances well enough that you could easily be a believable critic. So if you're considering seeking someone out and you want to know if someone is a mature professional, of course, client testimonials, referrals, stuff like that, experience, of course, the person needs to have experience, the person needs to have good ethics, but the person should have a very broad, wide understanding of his own profession and be able to relate it to complementary professions and perspectives. That's how I view a mature professional. And by the way, given how much trust society in general has in psychiatry and how much people in general trust in psychiatrists and their professional competency and ethics, do this experiment. Have conversations with various psychiatrists and psychologists and ask them, what do you think about the work of Dr. Evan Cameron? Watch the blank faces. Most people will have no freaking clue. Then go watch the documentaries, then do your homework, then Google Dr. Evan Cameron and go, how on earth could you not know about that stuff and call yourself a professional? It's a nice litmus test. Okay, so I always offer, if my ideas resonate with you and you want to seek me out for mentoring or change work, you can find me at provocativehypnosis.com. If you have any comments to this, please feel free to leave them wherever you find the video. Till next time, hope this was somewhat provocative and slightly enjoyable.